So I've entitled my talk today, The Moral Values of Altruism, Reflections from Civil Society's Response to the Refugee Crisis. This presentation I'm giving today is drawing from an ongoing research project that Doris just mentioned, which talks about, sorry, I just have my clicker there. Which talks about individuals who engage for the support of migrants in context of a refugee crisis. We talk about 3 points today. First of all, giving a little bit of context and talking about the so-called refugee crisis as a moral failure. We're talking then more specifically about the moral values of the volunteers we interview for our projects. And finally, I will talk a little bit about the political dimensions of these topics, talking about the boundaries between different forms of engagement. To start with, I would like to come back to the question of the Aquarius that was just mentioned in the last intervention. As you know, in June 2018, last year, after 629 migrants were rescued in the Mediterranean Sea by SOS Méditerranée and Médecins Sans Frontières, the Italian and Maltese governments publicly denied the entry of the boat into their territory. The public debates that developed during this period, one among many tragic migration-related events in Europe since the 1990s, opposed distinct visions of Europe. On the one side, the newly elected Italian government, in which we have the figure of Matteo Salvini, populist right-wing Minister of Interior, claimed that Italy did not have any responsibility to offer protection to these migrants. On the other side, the organizations that coordinated the humanitarian rescue mission argued, and I'm quoting here Caroline Klager from the head of emergency at MSF, argued that this whole episode is an indication of the failure of European migration and asylum policies. If you look at European asylum immigration policies, the humanity has gone. It's no longer about human beings, but about border management. We have lost our soul. This statement was echoed by El Haj Assi, the Secretary General of the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent Societies. He said that these are the values that are cultural values and values of civilization, and the world often looks up to Europe for those values. Not because Europe really owes this to the world, but because Europe embodies those values. That's what Europe stands for. That's what Europe is promoting in its diplomacy, in its policy, in its culture, in its civilization. When it comes now to applying those values and welcoming people in need through solidarity, through care, through support, through humanity, a failure to do so is obviously a betrayal of those values. Hence the context of the moral failure I was mentioning before. I would argue that this episode of the Aquarius is illustrative of what is at stake in the European migration policies in the moment. What is at stake, of course, is immediately is the lives of the migrants who risk everything to reach European Union territory. But there is also something else. What is at stake is the question, what kind of society are we? What kind of politics do we imagine when our governments leave migrants to die in the Mediterranean Sea? What are the moral values of our institutions? What are the moral values of our societies? Ultimately, this question of the moral values is about our identity as individuals, as social groups, or as societies. This is what the philosopher Charles Taylor argued. To know who you are, your identity, is to be oriented in a moral space, a space in which questions arise about what is good or bad, what is worth doing and what not, what has meaning and importance for you, and what is trivial and secondary. Values are intimately related to our identity, who we are. So the question is really, who are we as a society? Who are we as public institutions when we leave migrants to die in the sea? This question of the moral values has been really much at the core of the debates that surrounded the so-called refugee crisis since the summer of 2015. in response to the closure of borders by the part of governments and European Union institutions, against the moral failure of European governments, civil society has mobilized in the name of values of compassion, of hospitality, solidarity, and care to support migrants who attempted to reach Europe. In a recent book, Ala Siri has talked, for example, about an outpouring of expressions of compassion, to talk about the reaction of civil society. In this current context, the photo of Aylan Kurdi was what James Jasper defined as a moral shock, something that can't be ignored and that demands a reaction by the part of civil society. In our study, we analyzed many different charities and networks. And the morality, the question of the moral values, is always there. Here we have, just to show you the names of some of these initiatives, call to help refugees, call to care for refugees, call to support, to be hospitable, the notion of home, refugees at home. In 2016, a global survey commissioned by Amnesty International showed that these values are widespread across society. The survey in 27 countries shows that the vast majority of people, 80%, would welcome refugees in their country, in their neighborhoods, in their home. For instance, 83% of the respondents in the UK stated that they were ready to welcome a refugee into their neighborhood or in their household. Globally, only 17% said that they would refuse refugees entry in their country. So in our research project, we analyzed the individuals who engaged into altruistic actions towards migrants and refugees. And we analyzed how they talk about their motivations as well as their experience. We interviewed 150 volunteers in total, in many different charities and networks in France and the UK. And we asked them questions about how they define what they do, how they situate themselves in comparison to other actors, and how they can talk about their experience, how the experience of helping migrants and refugees has transformed them. The idea is to have a general picture of the language, the repertoire they use to talk about what they do. We talked to actors engaged in different types of networks and charities, people giving legal advice, people giving donations who go regularly to Calais in France, people giving emotional support, people who visit detention centers, people who host refugees in their home. In these interviews, the respondents tell us about many things, of course. But one thing in particular is that we found very interesting, the significance of moral values. The use of specific values is central, is crucial in the language that they use, and more generally, to define who they are, their identity. So what are these moral values then? How do people make sense of their engagement? We see here three general principles. The values of compassion, solidarity, hospitality, and care that I mentioned earlier are built around these three general principles. The first one is the idea that they could be us, and this is a quotation from one of the interviews that we did. The idea is that we help people because we have a feeling of a sense of a common humanity. The idea of empathy here is extremely strong. There is a suffering that we can understand. To feel compassion, to feel care, to feel the need to help, we must feel a form of similarity with the persons we help. We must feel a form of connection. And this is extremely strong in all the interviews that we've done. The second principle is that to help people, first of all, volunteers will have to evaluate the needs of refugees and also their deservingness. Volunteers will have to assess what are the needs of migrants. The focus really much is on their suffering, not so much on their rights, but on their suffering as human beings. To help someone, we must first assess the seriousness of their suffering. We must try to understand what they are going through. But also this question of the assessments of the need and the suffering is about something else. There is also the notion that this person we're helping, they deserve our help. here it's not only about the suffering of these people, it's also a judgment, a form of judgment about their character. And different criteria are involved here in this judgment about deservingness. People deserve our help because we feel a form of admiration for their resilience. People deserve our help because they are perceived as vulnerable, innocent, and someone has to step in. All people deserve our help because we believe they will make a contribution to our society. The last principle is that of responsibility and autonomy. What emerges in the interview is that volunteers step in because they feel they need to fill a gap. It is our moral duty to help migrants and refugees. The state doesn't do anything. Governments don't do anything. It's a question of autonomy. We act autonomously from the state, and responsibility. It's our moral duty to do it. If we don't do it, nobody else is going to help them. I have some quotations to illustrate this. Is the last bit. What is interesting is that this principle and the values of compassion, hospitality, care, altruism, ultimately, are presented by our respondents as being deeply entrenched in people's identity. It's not something they constructed. It's something that somehow has always been there for them. The idea is that some people have these values and some others don't. And this figure of the hero that was mentioned different interventions earlier is really interesting in this regard. So some people will tell us, I have these values of compassion and care because this is something that relates to my education when I was a child. This is something that relates to my experience as a child. This is something that relates to my experience, my family. Also, other people would tell us, many people would tell us, well, I have these values because I've lived abroad as a child, and this is something I can relate to humanity as a broader level because of that. Some others would tell us, living in London, for example, that they grew up in a multicultural environment, and this is what brought these values to them. Now, this is interesting to us. What is interesting is that these values of compassion and care are not something that they present as that they learned from their immediate experience or maybe from contemporary political debates about these immigration policies we talked about. No, it's something much deeper. It's something that is part of who you are, something much more intimate. It's almost mystical sometimes. The call for the charities were appealing to them because of what they present as their profound identity. It's something that they present as even natural for them. In the interviews that we've done, people find it difficult to put words on their engagement. Often the response to the question, why do you do that, is, I just had to do it. Some people tell us, well, talking about this is almost too intellectual. I'm quoting the words of one of our respondents. It's almost too intellectual. I think I feel a very strong connection to all people, and that's why I jumped in and helped these people. Now, this is interesting because this reflects part of the literature on moral values and humanitarian action, or volunteering. In this literature, moral values are often presented as being more stable than cognitive processes such as framing. Also, it's often argued that they are somehow constructed at this very deep level of our identity. They are part of who you are. They are your core identity, basically. And your engagement, your altruistic behavior, is a natural consequence of this. Now, this is something, now that in the last part of my presentation, I would like to question a little bit. Looking in particular at the transformation of these values among the people we interviewed. And here I will try to look at this question through the question of boundaries with other forms of engagement, the boundaries with different types of values. And from this perspective, it's important to note that civil society responded to the refugee crisis through different strategies. So one question, different responses. On the one side, as I mentioned before, we have acts of volunteers that we can qualify as humanitarian action. What is at stake here is the life of the people we want to rescue. On the other side, however, there is another response, which is a more politicized response. Civil society has responded to the refugee crisis through political protest, social activism. Actors have been involved in actions of civil disobedience and sometimes confrontational protest, in particular around the question of border controls. In the literature, these two different strategies, humanitarian action and political protest, have been analyzed as related to different logics of collective action. Two different fields, if you want to take Bourdieu's perspective, different fields of action constructed around distinct norms and values. On the one side, we have the values of compassion, humanity, and generosity. On the other side, we have different types of compassion, maybe more politicized types of values, social justice, equality, emotions of indignations, and questions related to human rights. More generally, the question is about the politicization or the depoliticization of these actions. We have political protest is political because it targets institutions, political institutions, of course, and it demands broad social change. Humanitarian action, on the other side, is often described as being apolitical because it focuses on the individual's life. It helps victims. In our study, we asked respondents about these questions. It's important to us to understand whether they define their engagements as being politicized or maybe purely humanitarian. And what emerges from this question is that the values I was talking about, compassion, care, hospitality, are not fixed over time. They are socially constructed and they often change over time depending on their experience in the field as well as on the connection they establish in the course of their engagement. In the course of the conversation we have with these volunteers, the majority of the people we interview distantiate themselves from politics. Some people have more politicized motivations. They will talk about social justice. But the picture is really much that of a depoliticized form of engagement. The idea is to have a concrete help. And here I'm quoting some of the people we interviewed. Humanity and compassion and generosity, so for me it's more about you, again, this notion of identity. You as a person rather than your political stance. So it's not a political thing that we're doing. However, this is not the end of the story. In the interviews, participants tell us about unexpected events, moments of rupture that lead them to become reflexive about what they do and somehow reframe their engagement. This is the fuzzy, the messy experience of being in the field, the dilemmas, the uncertain situations they're confronted with. These are situations in which their values will be questioned, situations in which compassion is disrupted, situations in which compassion simply becomes, it's not enough to just be compassionate. These situations are, for example, when volunteers would face police brutality, and this was the case in Calais. You have here a picture of the eviction of the camp in Calais. These situations are, for example, also when people witness the consequences of immigration, asylum policies in Europe. You have a picture of this is the Yardswood Detention Centre in the UK. A telling example here is that of a lady who described the shock of discovering the living conditions in detention centres. What she expresses is that she certainly realized the power of the state and the political choices that the European Union and governments are making by putting people in these detention centres. What she realized, basically, is the failure of migration policies. One thing that emerges then is that these notions of compassion, as I mentioned before, simply it's not enough. There are things that we can't ignore anymore. the political side of what we're looking at can't be ignored anymore. And here the picture that is emerging is complex. We have emerging a mix of humanitarian moral values that I mentioned before, compassion, care, but also emerging values that relate to social justice and inequalities. We have somehow a politicization of these engagement processes. The basic idea is that the volunteers can't remain silent on politics. They have to debate about border controls. They have to take into account European Union politics at a more general level. They can't remain silent on the closure of borders. They can't remain silent on the role of Frontex, for example. So to conclude here, in the call for participation for today, there was something about the lessons to be learned for the future. And maybe we think that there's maybe something interesting to be looked into here. How the values we are looking at, values of compassion and care, are constructed, but also renegotiated, reframed in the course of the experience in the field. The values are not so much an explanation of altruistic behavior. They are also something that actors are reflexive about and they can construct over time. From this perspective, we can see how boundaries between different forms of engagements can shift. The questions of compassion, care, hospitality become increasingly political in times in which they are endangered. In particular, in a context, as you mentioned before, in which the solidarity towards migrants and refugees is criminalized by governments. The actions of support, the basic action of providing help to refugees and asylum seekers and migrants, become political in themselves because they are pushed into the field of civil disobedience, in this context of criminalization. At a general level, I think we refer in our project to this notion of quiet politics that was coined by Askins in 2015. There is something very interesting here. It's the embodiment of political values. What our respondents tell us is that it's not so much through their discourses, through their ideas, and that they want to change things, but it's through what they do. Showing compassion as an act in itself, hosting someone in your home, providing care in Calais, can become a political act in itself. It is a form of quiet politics in the times we are living in. Now we'll conclude here. Thank you.